Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. And we're here today with special guest, Dr. Michael Lee, who's here to share with us conflict management in politics and personal relationships. So is it possible to address conflict both calmly and constructively when it arises? Well, today's guest is going to dive into just that. So Dr. Michael Lee teaches and writes in the areas of political communication and rhetoric. He received his PhD in communication studies at the University of Minnesota and his MA in communication and BA in political science at the University of Georgia. His research focuses on political branding, political identity, strategic communications, and audience positioning in American politics. And he's currently a professor at the College of Charleston. So welcome to the show, Dr. Michael Lee.
Thanks a ton, Marianne. I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, I've been looking forward to this discussion, and it cannot happen soon enough. With the extreme polarization that's happening in the U.S., are there main factors causing this that we should be aware of?
Oh gosh, what a huge question to start out with. There's so many factors. Americans have been growing apart, becoming more isolated, alienated, withdrawn from one another, less likely to know one another's last names, having more difficult times engaging strangers and even polite conversations. And then, of course, that's hypercharged in our polarized environment. And it's even made easier, of course, on social media, where we can each self-select into our own kind of self-reinforcing silos of everyone speaking to the choir all the time and leading to a world of kind of alternate facts where what I perceive to be going on in the world is not just different, but fundamentally opposed to what you foresee going on in the world. So, yeah, there's a lot of factors. Some are very new, some are very old.
Well, why don't you share with us the work that you're doing to help, I wouldn't say combat, because that would be kind of the wrong words we want to use, but to really kind of help offset these type of disagreements?
I like to talk about the work that we do in terms of cultural fight and cultural flight to make a play on our individual and our collective national nervous system. You know, nervous systems, when we're in conflict, when we perceive the world to be dangerous or an interaction to be dangerous, we can go into kind of to take it superficially, a fight mode or a flight mode. So we do panels, debates, speeches, book talks, film screenings. I host a podcast, you name it, all dedicated to healthy conflict and dialogue across difference, promoting exposure to viewpoint diversity and staying in the room with people who might see the world differently from you. And so when we're doing those, I try to work on fight issues and flight issues simultaneously. Fight issues being kind of the typical stuff that many might think of, which is red state, blue states, bigotry, cancellation, rage, anger, violence, etc. But the flight issues are a little quieter, a little more insidious. And this is the way in which we've become alone together, where we're preferring more silence, where we have less active or robust social networks. We feel less close to people, including our own family and friends. This kind of withdrawal, loneliness, isolation, even self-alienation, that is more of a quiet driver of polarization. And I think the two work simultaneously. The more we fight with one another, the easier it is to flee from one another. And the more we flee from one another, the easier it is to demonize one another because we know that much less about each other and then we're that much less close to one another. So when I'm doing this work, I'm trying to think about those fight-flight issues simultaneously, because if we're addressing one without the other, to me, it's like trying to mop up the kitchen floor while the sink is still on and the faucet and the sink is still overflowing, if you follow me.
Well, I can definitely follow that, and that makes sense on your discussion here. So, what are some ways that we can overcome these issues?
Well, I'd like to talk about this in terms of what we can do between each other and what we can do within ourselves. And so, in terms of conversation dynamics, the things I like to really talk about are the ways in which we can promote a humility about our own perspective and how much we know about the world, and expressing that humility in difficult conversations, even disagreements with one another, expressing curiosity about other points of view, even points of view we might find repugnant, because all of us are, I like to say that some of us face it all the time and all of us face it some of the time, which is just to say that we are more as individuals than the sum of our political opinions. And we might come to these political opinions for reasons that you can express curiosity about. The third one is that expressing curiosity and listening to people is not the same thing as validating them. It's not the same thing as supporting them, and it's not the same thing as agreeing with them. It's the same thing as staying in relationship with somebody. And I think that those are two very different things, because for some reason we feel now in this culture that if I sit in the same room with somebody who voted for a different group than I did, or has an opinion about a scientific subject that I don't share, that somehow I'm on their team, right? That somehow I'm associated with them. And I think that that's a wrong move in terms of facilitating robust connections. And the other thing we can do is think about what happens in ourselves. So that's stuff we can do between each other conversationally to express some humility and curiosity. But within ourselves, you can see the ways that you're activated when you come up against something that you don't agree with. What happens to your body? What happens to your thoughts? What happens to your eyesight? Does it get really narrow? Where does the stress go? Does it go to your hands? Does it go to your feet? Does it make your heart race? And so some sense of mindfulness about arguing as a kind of embodied activity. It's not just verbal. It's not just cranial in the sense that we think about it as producing arguments and thinking fast on your feet, but it's also affects us. And if it's affecting us in ways that lead to fight or flight without an ability to sustain and stay in the room, then we have a problem in terms of our relationships. And the other one is the way that it triggers our tribal anxieties. So if I'm afraid that if I'm seen having dinner with somebody by my friends, that they'll think that I'm on that person's team now politically. And then there's this fear that we have ingrained in us as humans of kind of excommunication, that if my friendships signal changing political allegiances, that somehow I'll be kicked out of the club, and then that fear of isolation can feel really, really violent at times. It can really activate our nervous systems.
Well, it seems that everything is so charged, especially when we look at holidays and family get togethers. What are some strategies that you would recommend that people use to have constructive dialogue?
First, I would suggest to find some common ground, and that common ground can be in values. So let's say you and I are sitting around a dinner table around the holidays, and you and I have vastly different opinions about gun regulations in the United States, to give a very specific example. So I could, if I wanted to debate you on that, I could start with the facts, right? And start with, let's say, how many guns there are in America, how many illegal guns there are in America, how many murders with guns, how many acts of suicide are committed with guns, and so forth. But it's very likely that you and I, as kind of rabid supporters on both sides of that position, have a very different view of the facts. We might operate in separate realities as far as those facts are concerned. So if I start there, we start in contention, we start in animosity, we start in antagonism. If we can find some common ground and start with shared values, then we can kind of work our way back to, okay, well, what are your sources and how much faith and trust do you have in those sources? What are the methods those sources use to gather this information? So common ground in terms of values might be, do you believe that our goal socially should be to promote a safe society where kids are safe to go to school, where you and I are safe to go to the grocery store, where we're safe to drive on roads without fear of being shot? And if we can find some goal there, then we can work backwards. And if that's not the case, I also suggested just finding common ground in terms of sustaining relationships. Like, I really like jazz music and you do too. Everybody, the whole culture is playing pickleball. So let's start there and try to work our way back to, okay, well, now we have a shared kind of fun relationship. We can talk about these factual or values-based disagreements. So the search for common ground, the search for shared meaning, I think has to be the first goal of any potentially contentious conversation.
Well, on that note, we're going to pause here for a quick break. We've been speaking with Dr. Michael Lee in regards to conflict management in political and personal relationships. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. We'll be right back after these messages from our sponsors.
Are you an author, speaker, or expert who is looking for more publicity? Visit radioguestlist.com and sign up for free interview requests from shows looking for guests. Radio Guest List is the #1 free booking resource for radio, podcasts, and TV talk shows who are looking for experts like you right now. Visit radioguestlist.com and sign up today to get the visibility you deserve.
There comes a moment when you realize you're somewhere special. When you discover that each beautiful creature that you see has been rescued from a life of absolute horror and brought to this incredibly free place. Here's where their lives were forever changed and where yours will as well. Discover over 500 tigers, bears, and lions at the brand new visitor center at the Wild Animal Sanctuary just outside Denver. For more information, visit wildanimalsanctuary.org. Discover true freedom at the Wild Animal Sanctuary.
It's one thing to become attached to your perfect home, but what do you do when that home becomes attached to you? A family in dire need of a fresh start, a mysterious house tied to the past. Buried deep within the foundation of the old Far Hill Manor lies a centuries-old secret. Dark forces or something stronger just waiting to be discovered. Caretaker, a supernatural thriller by breakout authors R.J. Halpert.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. We're here today with special guest, Dr. Michael Lee, who's here to share with us conflict management in political and personal relationships. So can you share some insights from the College of Charleston Civility Initiative and how it aims to address disagreements?
Yeah, a few things. We try to aim to reach 3 audiences simultaneously. The first is a national audience who, like yourself and me, are all trying to have this conversation about how can we live together peacefully and air our disagreements simultaneously. And so we try to reach this national audience by coming on shows like this. I host a podcast called When We Disagree, which is widely available on podcasting platforms. And the premise of When We Disagree is really simple, which is I ask guests, and the guests come from all walks of life. It's not experts. Anybody who comes on the show answers one question, which is, what's a disagreement you had that just stuck with you, that you couldn't get out of your head? In each episode, somebody comes on and narrates that story. And it could have been an argument with your mom 20 years ago, an argument with a mechanic 1 year ago, an argument with your boss at whatever time. These are personal, philosophical, professional, and political disagreements. And they really illustrate the important role of conflict in all of our lives, the varieties of ways we relate to conflict, and we try to come up in real time with lessons for both surviving and thriving within inevitable conflict. So the Civility Initiative, of which the podcast, When We Disagree, is a part, tries to reach that national audience. Then they try to reach a low country, Savannah, Charleston, Myrtle Beach, Beaufort, etc., and South Carolina and Southern audience in terms of our regional role in this national conversation. And then finally, I do debate, dialogue, listening, bias, empathy, media literacy, trainings and workshops on campus and here in Charleston, South Carolina for the wider community. So we try to reach these 3 audiences more or less simultaneously through a variety of different metrics, whether it's events, panel speeches, workshops, trainings, and then, of course, the show I host.
Yeah, it sounds like so much work that's being done to kind of move that needle forward so people can have civil discussions.
We are really trying. We are really trying. I have been, I started this about a year ago, just over a year ago, last two Halloweens, October of 23. And since then, it has become the defining passion project of my life. And we've done 20 something events. I've done dozens and dozens of speeches and interviews like this one. We've produced about 50 episodes of the podcast in a year. And I have been blown away by the audience of Americans here in the South, here in Charleston, here at my college, and then nationally with folks like you and your listeners who are deeply curious about how we can find each other amidst all this tension and polarization, are deeply fearful about the direction the country, and not just politically, not just Washington, but the direction we're all taking, how we're all getting caught in this kind of whirlpool, and we don't know what to do about it. And also simultaneously deeply hopeful when folks get together and have these discussions, the possibility for finding shared humanity and finding curiosity about people that you might not think you could even find curiosity about has been really, really inspiring.
It definitely is. And you touched on something I kind of want to dive a little bit more into, and it's this post election reaction
Uh-huh.
that people have had. Do you feel that it's evolved over this recent cycle?
I think that it depends on the community you're talking to. So I think I have interviewed people and done research on folks who look at 2016 um, and Hillary Clinton's loss to Donald Trump, Donald Trump's near win in 20, and then, of course, Trump's victory over Harris in 24, and say, this is a really simple story. This is a very simple story of a kind of identity-based bias that is baked into the American electorate. And that is one kind of hardened, very specific view about what happened in those elections. And then there's another view, and I interviewed Jamel Bowie from the New York Times, as well as several others here in Charleston and on my show, who have a very different point of view and say that electorates are really complicated. And people may say they vote for reasons that are actually not even driving them. In other words, do they even know why they are voting the way that they're voting? Or they're voting for very particular and unique issues that are specific to them and their locality. This point of view that says that electorates are really complicated and there's so much gray area that it's impossible to make simple meanings. Look at international trends. So many incumbent parties in the 24 election across the globe in a post-COVID kind of malaise, plus this rampant inflation, plus a kind of international throw the bums out, anti-status quo sentiment, who are looking for the biggest and greatest change possible, made similar choices, whether it's in Europe or Asia or the United States. So to say that the result of this election is because of very specific kinds of identity-based biases that are baked into the American electorate, according to this point of view, are insufficient. It's an insufficient explanation. And so to answer your question directly as to whether I've seen some evolution in the ways in which people view these elections, yes. And those evolutions really depend on the group you're talking to.
What role does empathy and emotional intelligence play in overcoming political polarization?
That's such a good question. I would say that empathy has to be a kind of primary point of view if we're doing civility work, or another term that people like to use is bridging work, finding bridges between ourselves or finding common ground. Because if we begin from a point of view that all human beings it's possible that in 100 years, people living then will look back at me and you and all of us and say, and something we're doing every day and don't even think twice about, how could those monsters live like that? In other words, what opinions in 50 or 100 years do you have? What practices in 50 or 100 years do you have? that the culture then will look back and say, I can't believe that that kind of evil could exist on a day-to-day basis. And so we're all exist in this kind of flawed sense, but we can kind of be ego involved and think that we have it all figured out and think of ourselves as these rational computers. And my opinions are the result of me neutrally and thoroughly investigating the best possible evidence and coming to the most rational conclusion. You, on the other hand, are subject to all kinds of biases and ignorance and bad sources and propaganda and brainwashing and so forth. And so you are, misguided, whereas I am deeply rational. And that's a real condescension. It doesn't see empathetically with what beliefs do for folks, how it helps them maintain their social ties, how they could be products of an environment, as are we all, how they can be wonderful human beings and have a deeply problematic opinion that you find to be monstrous. And so finding ways in empathetically, finding curiosity, having some intellectual humility about what you know and how much you have it all figured out, and how white is your hat and how black is their hat, I think are kind of primary dispositions if you're interested in civility work or bridging or detoxification or depolarization.
I think that that's also very important. Dr. Michael Lee, where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work?
Well, we have I would say the primary way to reach out and to connect with the work I'm doing is through our national podcast, which is When We Disagree, available. You can find it on When We Disagree on Google, of course, but we're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, etc. Anywhere you find your podcast, you'll find When We Disagree. And it's with me, Michael Lee, and that was an unintentional rhyme scheme. I'm happy to share. It's accidental after the fact. But episodes are bite-sized. They're meant for commutes, for walking your dog. And I think the show at its best really showcases the variety of voices, the variety of disagreements, the variety of conflicts within American life, and the varieties of ways we can approach them and at the same time find productive common ground. You can, of course, find our website and the work we're doing at the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston, and we keep that updated with a rotating series of events, panels, workshops, book talks, etc. And several of those are being hosted on YouTube and screened as well, so you can access our work there.
Well, Dr. Michael Lee, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
I'm so deeply appreciative. Thanks a ton.
Well, thank you, Dr. Michael Lee. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about conflict management in political and personal relationships. Make sure to listen to his podcast, When We Disagree, and check out his latest episodes. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.